My title, you'll recognize this saying from Peter Drucker, said famously, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I've adapted that to Agile, but I put a question mark because I'm not sure it does. I think you can do Agile internationally, globally, with different cultures, but you have to be a little bit careful. Culture for me is basically a shared system of attitudes, values, beliefs, meanings, and behavior. Hofstede, one of the great founders of interculturalism, called it the software of the mind. You can see it like that. There are all sorts of images for it. The iceberg, I think, has been a bit debunked now because it's a bit too static. So some people talk more about fuzzy cultures or about brushstrokes in an impressionist painting. The next slide is really, and perhaps we can make that a little bit bigger here. That would be great, yeah? That I call cultures at work, because I want to get away from the idea that we just talk about national cultures. When I was first asked to train senior software architects, there was a group I found quite difficult at the beginning. So I got a list, as you do as a trainer, of the participants. And I thought this is going to be really interesting because we've got people from India, and we've got people from US and Germany and different European countries. We're going to have a really interesting discussion about cultural differences. When I met these people, I realized that was completely wrong. These people were not at all concerned about national. They worked together extremely well. Their problem actually was not with different nationalities. Their problem was with people from different professional backgrounds. When I did some work with the HR people who were the client and the software people, I realized that actually they were two different cultures. They complained about each other. So the HR people said they don't give us what we want. And the software developers said, well, they don't tell us what they want. They don't know what they want. And I thought about it really when I was working on my book, and these pictures are taken from that. I thought actually there are probably 9 different types of thing that you might need to consider. And this came very much from the Siemens experience. As you know, corporate cultures are very different. Professional cultures, lawyers, medics, engineers have their own culture. Teams have their own culture. You have departmental culture. You sometimes have a management culture, and you have culture with particular functions. And these are in fact, the cultural factors, some people call them dimensions, which influence us. If you look at the Agile Manifesto from 2001, it contains certain cultural preferences. It has a preference for individualism as opposed to collectivism. It has a preference for, if we look at communication style, person over task. It has a preference for low uncertainty avoidance. So we say, okay, it's okay to make mistakes. We don't need to have everything perfect. And the other element, which is not necessarily in the manifesto, but I see in many discussions about Agile, is this area of power distance, the distance between the top person in the culture and the lowest person. And I think that much of the Agile approaches that I see, they assume that the hierarchies aren't so important. But how do you deal with a culture which has a very high power distance? I think many of these cultural attitudes that people have are very deeply rooted. And people talk about mindset, and I'm not sure if you can change a mindset, because a mindset, anyway, what is a mindset? Is it visible? Is it tangible? And I think it's extremely hard to, I think, to me, the point of what I'm talking about is actually not so much changing people's culture as recognizing what the culture is and then deciding how you can deal with that. But I think we need to be fairly realistic about the limits of changing culture and how much effort it involves. It looks very simple, but actually there's quite a lot of thought gone into this. This is a so-called dilemma reconciliation approach. Some of you know this from the interculturalist Franz Trompenas. He wanted to get away from talking about binary things when we talk about culture, just individual, collective, whatever, to say, okay, how do we square those binaries? How do we reconcile these dilemmas. And the one which is really fundamental to thinking about Agile globally is this global-local dilemma. This really means that, okay, and for Siemens, one of the options is not an option, this stay at home. Siemens was always an international company, always active on the global stage. Go native means, okay, that you just do things as people do locally, and you do things then differently in different countries, different places. Colonize is an extreme formulation of saying we want to standardize things completely across the world. And when in Rome means, okay, we reach a consensus. And what I think is exciting is when we start leveraging cultural differences to create synergies. And that's the 10-10 position at the top there. And that's what I think a lot of people now are talking about, not about coping with differences, managing diversity, but actually leveraging diversity for competitive advantage, for success. So it was a standardized process, but we needed to adapt it to the local situation. And that's the balance that we need to get. Some people call this, okay, think global, act local, or glocalization, whatever, these phrases are still around. Some of the diversity dimensions that are typically talked about are really like cultures, if you treat them like that. They are shared systems of attitudes, values, meanings, beliefs, and behavior. So I really like this picture, which is, I call the wheel of difference, where you say, well, of course, we all have our individual personality and our individualism. That's very important. But we have some things which we can not really influence, like age, gender, sexual race and ethnicity, national origin, physical and mental ability. These are relatively static. Of course, age changes over time, but we can't influence them that much. The next circle are things that we can influence and change much more, like family status. You may get married, may have children, whatever. Your appearance, you may have a tattoo, or you may change your hair color, whatever. Region, you may move around, and so forth. And on the outer circle are the factors that I mentioned before about the workplace. So basically, what I'm talking about is that here, these are all things that influence our behavior. And if you want to understand someone, you don't need to go through all of these things. That would be quite crazy. But you might need to consider which of these is important and what role it plays on influencing that individual. Because these things actually affect how people think. You all have these multiple cultural identities, what some people call multi-collectivity, or like the Michelin man with the different rings, and this wheel of difference. If we want to understand people, we need to know about this. So I think that the Agile Manifesto, it's not surprising that it reflects some values that you'd find a lot in the USA, and you'd find a lot in men, and you'd find a lot in software developers, because that's the cultural background from which it came. It's a cultural embodiment of those values. And there's nothing wrong with that, but if you're adapting to working in other cultures, you need to really think about how far this works. It's not just a one-off thing that you suddenly become culturally competent and you tick a box and that's it. It's a lifelong process. And it goes from accepting cultural differences to understanding them, to adapting to them. This may include like code switching, for instance, that you can switch between cultures, functioning in them, creating these synergies that I mentioned, and ultimately what I call bridging cultures. And this is a bit like you've been talking about the elephants dancing and the elephants doing the tango. You do need to stretch before you dance. I read that in one of the posts in LinkedIn. You do need to practice this and develop it. And you develop it through reflection, through feedback, through experience. I like the phrase by George Box, who says that all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think this can be a useful thing if we don't take it too strictly, to think about what we have to think about when we're trying to do things globally or with different cultures, in a diverse team, in a diverse organization. You'll recognize, hopefully, culture 1 and 2. This is just simplified to 2 different cultures meeting. That is this wheel of difference. And then we see that actually this is placed in the context here. So you need to consider culture not just as an isolated factor, but in the context within particular situations. And the answer to me about how do we deal with this is in 5 basic steps here. The first step is to basically scan your own culture. So think about what are those values that you have. Think about all those elements, what influence you, where are you coming from? And that is a vital first step that many people don't ever bother to do. The second step is to scan the people you're working with, your stakeholders, and do an analysis of them, scan their background. And then when you've done that, identify what the differences are, but also, very importantly, and sometimes neglected, identify the similarities. The fourth step is having a common vision or goal or target, so agreeing on that. And that is absolutely crucial. That will bring people together, however great the differences are. That will really bind you together if you're really convinced. And the fifth stage is just the implementation stage of this. I talk a lot about toolkits. I use that word in the title of my book, in the subtitle. But you can now talk actually about learning ecosystems. So to do this and to help people to do this, I think an organization like Siemens or your department or your business unit, you need to be collecting all different sources, not just do training. As a trainer, I think training is important and has an impact, but collecting everything you can together, maybe on a platform, and providing that support so that people can understand those other cultures. And it's not a question of lists of do's and don'ts for different cultures, because those will never really fit the mark. They are a little bit dangerous because they give you a bit of a false sense of security. You need to have a differentiated approach to understanding your stakeholders, the people you are collaborating with. My feeling is that we need to be aware of these cultural differences. Don't overestimate them or underestimate them. Sometimes people get a bit obsessed with culture and say everything is because of culture. And sometimes people go the other extreme and say nothing is to do with culture. I don't think either of those extremes are very helpful. I think we need to realize the role of those cultural differences. And if you do that, I think Agile can work very well in many different contexts and many different places. And I don't think it's a question of culture eating Agile for breakfast. I would like to see culture and Agile eating breakfast together. I think the first step is to, before you get going and in dealing with your project or your task or whatever, you need to take some time to think about what are the potential similarities and differences in the way that you want to work together, in the attitudes to work. So within that, I would suggest that you look at, for instance, how you want to communicate. You have to come to an agreement. In what situations do you use virtual communication? When do you do one-to-one communication? Which channels do you use? What do people prefer? And there are other areas that you need to think about, like, for instance, the area of decision-making. How are you going to make decisions in your team? So how empowered are the people, or how far are they supposed to wait for some instruction from the team leader, for instance? You need to solve some basic things, like you have differences in the time zones. So how are you going to deal with that? How are you going to make sure that nobody is disadvantaged? Sometimes that's a very simple thing, but it gets quite neglected. Ultimately, I think that's where you can use this bridging approach, because the central point of that is to have this common vision and goal. That's where you have to agree on it. And you don't just agree on it on a piece of paper and everybody signs it, but you must agree that it is also given the right priority. Spend that time, invest time, even virtually, you can do that, saying before we get going, before we start things, let's just talk on a meta level about what styles are we comfortable with and how do we want to work together. I think what I would advise you to do, actually, when you're implementing Agile, is to make sure that the people who implement it reflect different perspectives. So that's the same as I would see it like if you do product development. you need to involve people, perhaps who also reflect then your users. So my advice would be not translating it, but having diverse teams of people, which maybe reflect all the stakeholders that you're involved with, to develop your agile approaches.
I hope everybody out there felt that you learned something really valuable today.
Thank you for having me. Thanks very much. Great to be with you. All the best then. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.